And joining us now to answer your health questions about marijuana, and joining me in studio here is CBC medical contributor Dr. Peter Lynn. Thank you again for joining us on this Sunday ahead of the legalization of marijuana. So we did do a call out, and we've given you some of these questions too to our viewers over Twitter to send us some of the questions that they may have regarding health and marijuana. So our first question comes from Sean, and he asks, how does driving under the influence of marijuana compare to distracted driving? Dr. Lynn.
Yeah, so this is bad, and worse kind of situation, right? So the problem with distracted driving, if you're, let's say, looking at your phone, you're completely not looking at the road. At least if you're using marijuana, the thought is that you're still staring at the road, but your reflexes are all slow, your processing power is slower. And the worry is that if people start doing everything together, so they've had some marijuana, now they're looking at their phone, and that's the concern that we have, is that they're not going to replace one with the other. And on top of that, if there's alcohol involved, then we're going to increase that whole mix. So alcohol plus the marijuana plus distracted driving is probably going to happen together. So for sure, distracted driving is bad, marijuana is also bad, and alcohol is bad. But I think when you put all three together, that's the worry that the police officers are going to have, that maybe we're going to have an increased number of accidents that way.
All right. Okay. So there's your question, Sean. So another question that we got was, how long does marijuana actually stay in your body?
Yeah, that's the interesting one. Okay, so in other words, when you inhale marijuana, for example, from a cigarette, basically it gets broken down into a bunch of different chemicals, like let's say about 80 different things inside the body. And so therefore, most of those things are quite fat soluble, meaning that it will hang out inside your fat cells. So it gets stored up. So if I were to just take one hit right now, you could probably still see something in my urine or in my blood, let's say out to about 3 days. But if I'm chronically using it, I've loaded up a lot of stuff into my fat stores. So now, even if I stop, there's still going to be stuff coming out from my fat cells back into the blood and into urine. And so therefore, it'll stay testing positive. But the thing is, it doesn't mean that I'm impaired. It just means that there's still these chemicals roaming around. And therein lies the problem of people going to work. You know, we're talking about the police. You know, they have to wait. You know, some places it's 28 days because they don't want anything to be found inside the person, which means you have to wait, let's say, out to a month if you're a chronic user. And if you just use it once, it would be about 3 days. So that's why I think we're going to have to figure out at your workplace, what are their rules going to be? So let's say you're doing something that's important for safety. Everybody might have a different rule. Some places say, well, the effective pot is going to be gone in, let's say, 4 to 6 hours. So as long as you didn't do it within the last 8 hours, you're okay. So then you can come to work. But then if I check your urine, it'll still be positive for a couple of days. The concern is, let's say I'm a police officer and I'd arrest you. And then you challenge me and say, I think you were taking pot. And then we check your urine and it's positive. The other side could say, well, you were using drugs that could have altered the way you thought, and so therefore the charges are no good. So I think that's why the police have to deal with this thing, that if the test is positive, does that get rid of all the charges for criminals as well? So it's a little
Pretty
more complicated.
Right? Absolutely. All right. Well, I hope that somewhat answers that question. And we've got another question from Twitter user Shine a Light. And what they had to say is, I'm expecting that once legal, there will be a steady increase of use within the home. So how little will it take to intoxicate children? And Dr. Lynn, we were talking about this, that, you know, a lot of people compare it to the use of alcohol. But, you know, if you're a parent at home having a glass of wine and your child is there, they're not doing secondhand consumption. But if you are smoking marijuana, there is that.
Correct. And so that's the concept of secondhand smoke. Now we have secondhand marijuana. And children being smaller, it depends on how close you are to them when you're smoking. And so therefore definitely can go across to the child. Now the exact number we can't tell because it depends on how close you are, how many cigarettes you're having, and so on and so forth, and how confined the space is. Just like secondhand smoke, it's hard to figure out how many that people are getting. But in secondhand smoke, we sort of say if you smoke a pack, that's about 4 or 5 cigarettes that the child has smoked, so roughly in that ballpark. So with marijuana, maybe it's going to be in the same area. Our concern is that children, their brain is developing. And so the worry that we have is that we have these cannabinoid receptors in our body. They're doing good things, but now we are supplying an extra chemical that can stimulate that area. So in a child, they're still building their brain. And so that stimulation may change the way the brain becomes wired. And that's really what the concern is of when should people be allowed to use this stuff as children, because now you're changing the wiring of the system. Whereas when you're older, the wiring is done. And so now, yes, it might not be working well, your computer, but at least the computer is built already. Whereas the children, you're building the computer at that same time that you're exposing them to these chemicals.
So would ultimately then the most safe answer to that question be maybe don't do it in the home when you've got a child in the same way that we have cigarettes,
same with
try to
smoking,
smoke outside.
and don't do it in the car, because then the car will be trapped with that stuff. Maybe if you're doing the oils, it'll be less exposure, for example, or the edibles will be less exposure to the child. But then we have to make sure that the edibles, the kids don't get into the brownies and things like that. So that's why the edibles won't be available for another year.
Right.
And that's because they need to have packaging, labels, and everything else to make sure that the children don't accidentally get into it.
Okay, so that's also a complex situation here. All right, we've got another viewer question from Ann Digby, who wrote, are there any restrictions or concerns when donating blood if you've used marijuana?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So that one I actually had to go look up, and I looked up the American donation societies and all that stuff, and they said that they don't test for THC in the blood, and their rule is that you cannot be intoxicated when you're giving the blood. In other words, the same thing, like you can't be intoxicated with alcohol and donate blood. But in terms of the amount that might be in the blood will be very low. And so therefore, and it's not going to affect the next person because those are metabolized chemicals, meaning they're broken down already. So chances are the person that's receiving the blood is not going to be high or anything like that. And also because they need the blood so badly, they're not going to turn away, good blood for people in this fashion. If you've injected any needles, in other words, drug abuse, they don't want that because then we might be picking up hepatitis and all those other kind of diseases. But in terms of just pure pot use, doesn't seem to be any rules that you cannot donate blood. So you can continue to donate blood, just not when you've used it recently and you're under the influence.
Okay, all right. That's a good answer there. And so now we've got also another question here from Stanley, who wrote into us and had to ask, what are the effects of cannabis in tea? Let's say you don't want to smoke it and you want to put it in tea. Maybe you've got kids.
Yes. So tea, it turns out you can't just sort of put the flowers in there and just pour hot water in it. It tastes terrible. And so what you have to do is that THC is fat soluble. So it doesn't like to hang around with water. It's kind of like mixing oil and water. They just don't mix together. So pouring hot water in there is not going to get the stuff out. And so therefore they have all these little recipes that you have of how you got to put some butter and things like that. So you have to put something fatty to try and extract it out. You do need the heat in order to get the THC into the active form. So that's why when people vaporize it or they burn it in a cigarette, what they're doing is they're basically providing the heat to convert the chemical. So you'll need the heat, but you'll need an extraction method. Now the bad news, I guess, if you want the THC is that that's not a very good way to extract it with making a tea. However, some people like that, and so there's recipes that you can look up as to how best to get the tea and not make it taste so horrible.
Sounds a lot easier just to put a tea bag in with some hot water. Okay, and this is one last viewer question from Twitter user Bones, and he writes this: how do cannabinoids interact with dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin against different types, serotonin agonist types of drugs?
Yeah, so there's a lot of people taking antidepressants and antipsychotic medications, those kinds of things. And that's our concern, is because cannabinoids, we have them in our body, and so they are a neurotransmitter. In other words, the brain cells use these chemicals to talk to each other, just like serotonin. Those are all neurotransmitters. So therefore, we will unbalance that situation. So that's why some people get more sleepy, for example. That's why some people get the munchies, because you're affecting that system. And so that's why for the elderly or anybody taking these medications, we want them to check for drug interactions. Because think of marijuana as a drug that you're going to be putting into your system that's going to go into your head. And so therefore, we want to make sure that you're safe and not clashing. So that's why for all of our seniors that are thinking about this, or anybody with mental illness that's taking medication, you really have to check things out to make sure that drugs are not clashing when having bad side effects. We want you to get the good effects, but we don't want it to have a clash effect. And that's why the drug interaction side is going to be important. And later this year, sort of the Seniors Coalition, they've sort of, the medical folks have been coming up with a guideline on what we should do with the seniors that are taking so many medications. So we're going to have to wait until the end of the year before we get guidance. So for now, I think if you're taking a lot of mental health drugs, or if you're a senior taking lots of drugs, that's when we slow down and say, let me find out the information first before we get a problem.
So see your healthcare professional first before you decide just to indulge if you are taking a lot of these. All right. Well, we have so many more questions, but we don't have any more time, Dr. Lynn. As per usual, it was wonderful to have you here in studio. That is CBC medical contributor Dr. Peter Lynn, and he joined us here to answer your health questions on cannabis use. And of course, we want to know what you think about today's segment. You can always tweet me at Aarti Poll or email us at yournews@cbc.ca, and we'll be back in just a moment.